style method, which would be your Republican Party will actually choose those. And we are very fortunate to have Brant Frost. Brant is an amazing young man. He's just a wealth of knowledge. I've spoken to him in 30 minutes, and he's just about the most humble guy I've met. And he knows so much. And he was quick to tell me that he's not the smartest guy in the room, but this is definitely his topic of interest, and he can tell you so much. So what we'd like to do, he's going to go through the topics and give you about a 15-minute presentation. After that, you'll have the opportunity to ask any questions. So please be thinking, maybe take some notes as he's discussing this. Be prepared to ask some good questions. And we hope to have a learning experience here. This is one of the most significant things that has happened in the Republican Party or in politics probably, I thought in the last 100 years. Brant told me at least in the last 50. But I'll let him elaborate on all that. And Brant, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. Can y'all hear me all right?
Yes.
Good. Y'all hear me now? In your face. I'll try not to spit on it. Well, good morning. Good morning, everyone, and I appreciate you coming out here on a rainy day. It's really encouraging to see so many folks out here. It's really encouraging coming over from Coweta. I know a lot of folks here, and I look forward to getting to know the rest of you today. My topic for today, the title is "Let's Restore the Republican Party," and it's going to take about 15 minutes, and we have some cards here. If y'all haven't got one already, it covers some of the bullet points I'll be discussing today, and our state committee member from Coweta, Jim Campbell, will be handing those out along with our precinct chairman Lee Norman from Coweta as well. Appreciate that. And my topic for today is somewhat different than what you're used to hearing. Generally at events like this, you hear about a candidate describing themselves, you hear people talking about why they should be in office, or you hear people talking about a public policy issue like abortion, gun control, or Common Core. But I'm going to be talking today about the process. And the reason that's important is because without the right process, we're never going to get the right people to implement the right policies if we don't first get our process straight. And to begin with, I'd just like to say how my position on this issue of caucuses, conventions versus primaries has changed over time as well as I've come to learn more and study more. Originally, I thought, as I think a lot of us did, that caucuses had hardly been used ever. They were just an old relic of the past, and primaries would always been the way it was done. It would always be how it would be done. But as I read more, I came to find out that wasn't the case. For over 100 years, they'd been used. They were ethical. They were a good way to get people together. You'd have folks from all over the country, all over the state get together in a city, St. Louis, Chicago, Atlanta, to hammer out an agreement and choose a new leader for the party. It demanded consensus. Votes were taken in the open. There wasn't any electronic, secret voting with no paper trail. And it was really encouraging, particularly when I saw all the complaints we have today about voter fraud and all the issues we have today. I realized that there was an alternative out there. I'm going to be bringing up a couple points for you today, and I hope to get through this as quick as I can because I want to have a dialogue with you. I don't want this to be a monologue where I'm talking to you. I want to exchange ideas with you. My first point that I'd like to bring up to you today is that the process we have today, the primary process as we know it, does not encourage deliberation. I think that's self-evident to you. If you just look at the primaries that we had for president in 2012, Mitt Romney, for all of 2011, was consistent 30%. And what was happening to all the conservative challengers? Huckabee, Trump, Palin, Bachmann, Gingrich, Kaine, up and down, up and down. I mean, almost every week there was a new conservative alternative to Romney. And I don't think anyone here changed their mind 8 times during that season. I had 2 candidates during that process. One dropped out, and I think that's typical of a lot of y'all, but I don't think any of us changed our mind 8 different times in 6 months. And the reason you see that is because we don't have deliberation anymore. We have media-driven momentum, where the media talks about him, and so his poll numbers go up. And then the media talks about his poll numbers going up, and then his poll numbers go up even higher. And they say, well, he's a serious candidate now. Why? Because they made him that, not because he has any significant support in the grassroots. The second point I'd like to talk to you today goes into my This first point goes into the second. The process we have today does not demand consensus. I think we all remember the Iowa caucus. How many of y'all stayed up late watching those results? Anybody? Oh yeah, it was just classic political drama, right? Something right out of the television. Santorum up by 30 votes, then Romney up by 10, then Santorum up by 5. Santorum ended up winning that caucus. But if you look at the numbers, the final numbers there, it was 25% for both candidates. And sadly, we have a system today where you got primaries that don't require a majority. In Georgia, we require a majority to get nominated for any office. But we don't require it for our presidential primary, and no other state requires it either. So what you have is, you have a small fraction of the party that's supported by the media and the northeastern establishment and has a whole lot of money, getting only about a third of the vote in these early primary states, but they win because our folks are fractured. You've got Santorum, you've got Paul, you've got Huckabee, all the candidates who ran in 2008 and 2012. You split the vote, and we end up losing, and then the establishment guys in the media say, well, that's it, he's the nominee. Only a few states have voted, and he only got a third of the vote. But because we have a fractured system, they anoint this guy, they take the crown, and put it on their little Napoleon's head. The third point I'd like to talk to you about follows right after this. Who is in charge? The establishment. And I'd like to ask you this question. If a friend of yours told you he wanted to run county commissioner or state house, say Matt Ramsey decided to retire and a friend of yours said, I want to run for state house, I think I can make a difference. The first thing that would probably come to your mind when he asks you, what do you think I need most? Money. Not just a little money. A whole lot of money. And who has the money in the Republican Party today? The establishment. We've got the votes, but they've got the money. And the problem in the primary process is numbers aren't good enough. You've got to have the money to reach the people. Without it, they're not going to hear your message, and they're going to start to believe what they're seeing on television, that this guy really isn't viable, and it's a wasted vote, you need to vote for the other guy. And we see this time and time and again. Candidates who have the heart of the party constantly are defeated by candidates who are our third and fourth choice because they don't have the money to reach enough people. And it's really unfortunate. If you look at another issue with the finances is where the money's coming from. In 2008, a third of Mitt Romney and Rudy Giuliani's campaign totals came from banks like Lehman Brothers and Citi. Those are the same banks that got bailed out. And if you look at the sheer dollar amounts of their contributors, you had 55% going for Giuliani was $2,300 or more. I don't think there's many people who we would consider grassroots who can cut $2,300 checks. Some of us have been blessed, some of us can, but most of us can't do it. But he raised 55% that way. Who do you think he would have represented if he'd been nominated? And McCain, Mr. Campaign Finance, McCain-Feingold, 35% of his money came in that way. So it's really a difficult thing to find candidates who represent the party who can raise this kind of money when the establishment has already picked their candidates and are funding them so heavily. Which goes into the fourth point. I don't think this will come as a shock to any of you. The price for running for office is just too darn expensive. In 2012 and 2008, $500 million was spent in the Republican primaries. Not against Democrats, but against each other. $500 million. If you look at Georgia, lest you think this is only a problem for the national level, in 2012, we had candidates spending in one race $1 million just to get reelected to Congress. An incumbent had to spend that much. In the gubernatorial race of 2010, $11 million was spent by the candidates. Nathan Deal spent $3.1 million, Handel spent $2.8, John Oxendine spent $2.6, and remember, Deal spends $3 million to win, Handel spends $2.8 to lose. So just to come close is a $3 million proposition right starting off. $11 million, folks. And remember 2010, the race down to the 2nd District, Mike Cowan, the great conservative running against Sanford Bishop, he lost by just a few thousand votes. because no one thought he could win until the last few weeks of the campaign. An extra $100,000, one or two more mailers would have put him over the top, and he'd be in Congress today. We'd have an extra vote standing up to Barack Obama. But because we waste so much money tearing each other down and giving the Democrats talking points to whack us with in the general, we lost that election. And another point I'd like to address with you, something which I think we all comes to mind when we talk about primaries. Primaries, we say, are good because more people participate, right? Caucuses are good too, but not as many people participate, and we want more participation. But actually, when you look at the numbers, in 1972, when primaries were first used as the system for nominating candidates, 31% of the electorate participated in them in 1972. By 2012, that number had dropped by nearly 50% to barely 16% of the total electorate. If you compare that to the presidential general election turnout, in 1972 there were 55% of the electorate who showed up to vote for Nixon or McGovern. By 2012 it was 57.5%. We are actually at a 40-year high in voter turnout to participate in presidential general elections. But if we had fallen by that same measurement, a 50% measure, we'd have only had 29% of voters show up for a general election. And if you compare that 16% turnout across the board to the 13% turnout for the Iowa caucus, you see that the numbers really aren't that different, particularly when you consider where that extra 3% coming from. It's coming from Democrats and moderate to liberal independents who come over and vote for people like McCain and Romney. And it's wonderful if McCain and Romney can get nominated with Republican voters. But we are the folks who should make the decision, not Democrats crossing over to stage their own little Operation Chaos. The fifth point, my sixth point, I have just two left and then we can move to questions. Sixth point I'd like to talk with you about is the horrible imbalance of our system today. If you look at the national level, in 1968, 41% of all the delegates to the National Convention were chosen by primaries, and 56% were chosen by conventions. By 2012, that number had moved to 70%. Close to 75% of all delegates were chosen by primaries, and only about 20% were chosen by conventions. And what that does is it puts an unnecessary influence on having enough money to compete, on having to compete in these massive, bunched-up Super Tuesday primaries, which actually depress voter turnout because most of the time the election's over after Super Tuesday. 20 states have yet to vote, so you've got about 40% of the country whose vote is no longer needed, which is one of the reasons you've seen lower turnout. Even as more people have participated in presidential elections, lower turnout in the primaries because people think, what's the use? My vote won't matter. It'll all be decided in a couple states. And lastly, just some background on this whole issue. We've all grown up hearing of the famous conventions of the past, reading about them in history, watching the famous speeches, Reagan's 76 impromptu address, Goldwater's speech at the National Convention in 64. We've seen them all. We've heard about them. But I wonder if we've ever thought about where they come from and what's the background of them. And it's really a stark difference. The convention process was first developed in 1831 as a way to bring transparency to the political process. And it became so popular that a year later, both the major parties, the National Republicans, which would become the Republicans later on, and the Democrat Party adopted them and have used them ever since. It wasn't until 1912 that primaries first started being used at all. And it was at the instigation of the progressives who didn't like the process by which you have deliberation and thoughtful consideration by party activists. They wanted to be able to get as many people in there as possible so they could put as many ill-informed, low-information voters as they could into the process to try to demagogue issues and get folks elected. And you know what the progressives gave us. They gave us the League of Nations, World War I, the Federal Reserve, and direct election of senators. So I think we know what we want to do with any suggestion of theirs. In fact, our grandparents saw this problem and corrected it. Within 10 years of 1912, primaries had pretty much fallen out of use. There were a few that were still used, but they were mostly tests of strength to see how strong a candidate could perform in that scenario. But most states, about 40, still use conventions because it was a better way, cost less, it was less divisive. And it wasn't until 1968 that the lid started to blow off the pot. And lo and behold, where do you find the trouble? The far left. In 1968, the the anti-war, far left, anti-American bunch wanted to take the Democratic nomination. They weren't nearly a majority of their party, but they had a lot of passion, so they thought they deserved the nomination just by virtue of working for it. The problem was the Democrat Party was not a far left party at that time. And so the nomination went to Hubert Humphrey, who was an old-fashioned liberal. You know, the kind that actually like America? If there's any liberals in the room, I'm sorry. I'm sorry you're a liberal. And so what they decided to do was they thought that they deserved the nomination because they'd won a couple primaries. Their candidate, Eugene McCarthy from Minnesota, had won a few primaries, but he hadn't participated in any of the convention states where the party activists and the grassroots were choosing the delegates. So Hubert Humphrey, the vice president, ended up winning. And this caused a real schism. I mean, any of y'all who remember that watching on TV, the 68 convention, that was just, you talk about Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Wall Street is kindergarten compared to what they did in 68. And that threatened to split the Democrat Party wide open into three big factions. And you had the Southern Democrats, the old-style liberal Democrats, and the anti-war left, the new liberals, and they had to find a way to bring them back together. So the establishment of the Democrat Party, the Richard Daley, big boss of the city, decided that we'd give a bone to those dope-smoking hippies. We'll let them have a commission. And we'll even name it after one of them. We'll call it the McGovern Commission. And so this commission was set up to look at reforming the process. And the establishment didn't think anything of it. The establishment knew that resolutions come and go, commissions come and go, everything stays the same. But the anti-war left saw an opening when they knew an opening when they saw it. So what they proceeded to do was they packed it with their people and proceeded to institute all sorts of reforms. They wanted to use the Republican style, the kind the Republicans have been using for 100 years. They wanted caucuses, conventions, where their passion and enthusiasm could win the day. But the establishment wasn't going for that. They preferred delegates selected by committee. Believe it or not, folks, in the old days, the Democrat Party, we didn't do this on our side, but the Democrat Party selected a large chunk of its delegates by committee, committees that it took years to get on. So for all their talk about democracy, the Democrats have been an oligarchy from way back, and they wanted to keep that power in the hands of the corrupt big city bosses like Dick Daley. But they couldn't just go away with nothing, so they had a compromise. They decided to go with more primaries. Well, neither side was happy with that, but they both got a little bit out of it. The New Left figured, well, we've got more numbers, primaries will be good for us, we can at least have a voice. But in the end, the establishment got the upper hand because they knew that in primaries, you have so many voters, so many low information voters who don't take the time to observe the process just because they got so many things going on in their life and they're not really that into politics anyway. But now that they're voting, we got the money in the establishment to put it to the candidates we think should be nominated. So even though more people would be voting now, the candidate who had the money would be the one who would actually reach those voters, and the establishment had the money. So basically what you have is two systems. One system conceived in the more than 150 years ago as a way to reform the process and bring more openness. The system which nominated Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, Abraham Lincoln, Calvin Coolidge, Theodore Roosevelt, great American statesmen. Indeed, 3 of our 4 presidents on Mount Rushmore were chosen through the convention process. And then you have another system which was conceived in far-left lunacy, cobbled together as a compromise between corrupt city bosses and the far left of the Democrat Party, and which has had ramifications of cutting out the party grassroots, of making money, the new golden calf in the process, and all kinds of other unintended consequences of our far-left experimentation. And as usual, they're sorry. They really didn't mean it. It was just their intentions are all that counts. But the fact of the matter is we can do better. If we move to a convention system, we will see thousands of new people come into the Republican Party. If we rediscover this system, we'll see
millions of dollars coming into the party. People will once again feel like they have a voice. If you've ever been to Iowa and seen the enthusiasm, the young people who come in from all over the country to participate because they know that their activism can make a difference, and they don't have to be self-funded or independently wealthy to have an impact. And that is the choice you have, my friends. Two systems. A broken system that relies on low information voters, which are controlled by big money and big media, all under the thumb of the elites who have driven us into the ditch we see today, who've lost us 2 elections. Or another system, a proven system, nearly 200 years old, which relies on you, the grassroots, the passionate, high information American patriots, to choose the bold leaders who will offer the bright red choices that will not only lead our party back to victory, but will lead our nation back to prosperity. This is your mission, to save our party as the conservative voice in America and to preserve your children's future. Thank you very much, and God bless you.
That was an excellent presentation. I'm sure some of you have some questions, and we would like to start, if you raise your hand, if you have any questions about the caucus process. President.
I have a question. I know we voted on a resolution on caucus in the 3rd district. And I'm just curious, if we were to move forward with this in Georgia, what would be the process to do that? And whose decision is that in the end? Is that the executive committee of Georgia?
I was hoping someone would ask that question. Actually, it's very attainable. We don't even have to go through the General Assembly. What we need to do is either the state convention can do it or the state committee, because it requires a rules change. We have to add some rules to the state party rules. 3/4 of the state committee can do it, or 2/3 of the state convention. Now, unfortunately, the time for the deadline for rules has expired for this year's state convention, but that's okay, because we need a little time to get folks educated, to help them see why this is good for our party. And what we need to do now is all of us who are delegates to the state convention need to support these resolutions. The resolution will be coming up, and give us overwhelming support for it, so that then we can tell our state committee members who represent the 3rd District, I'm on the state committee, Jim Camp, Linda, Bob Ross, we can empower them to go and say, look guys, the convention is overwhelmingly for it. We need to start moving toward this. And then the state committee, through our lobbying, like they say, sometimes you have to see the flames sometimes you have to feel the heat to see the light. I guarantee you, the folks who are on the state committee, they're our friends and neighbors. Folks like Linda and Bob. They'll listen to us if we make it clear that we want control over our party again.
Sharon.
Brent, is the actual resolution on the website? On this website?
Yes, the resolution is on the website, and it has been submitted to the state committee on resolutions. I'm actually serving on that resolutions committee. I've been recommended to serve by our district chairman, who also supports this reform and has made it a prominent part of his campaign. So it will be discussed, and I look forward to telling folks how much Fayette County supports it. Yes.
Right. Thank you for that report. Very interesting, dragging us outside the box. I would like to know more about the mechanics of how this is done. How do you proportion delegates? Is every state going to do this? And there's a difference, I think, between the Democratic style of caucus and the Republican style, which is probably more detailed than we have time to go into today. Can you suggest some place to self-educate on this?
Yes. There's many places. To begin with, the RNC, I'll tell you, has a crazy system for delegate apportionment. There's a 10-step process to how you get delegates. In Georgia, it's very simple. You get every county, the state convention gets one automatic delegate, and then they get one additional delegate for every 1,000 votes that the Republican candidate got in the last election. In Coweta, we have 41 votes because Romney got 39,600 votes. So he gets 39 votes for the 39,000, and he gets a vote for the 600 because if you're on the high side of 1,000, you also get a vote. So we got 40 votes there, plus one automatic is 41. It's the same equation everyone uses here in Georgia. It's very simple and straightforward, and it's a good measurement because it represents not numbers of population, because you have counties like Fulton and DeKalb, which have big population, but there are not many Republicans there. So this system, it takes into account Republican voters and Republican activists rather than just the general population. In terms of the process, it would be very similar to what we have right now at the state convention. We go to the state convention, we have a ballot for chairman, or in this case, we'd have a ballot for governor. We'd vote our choice. Whoever came in last would probably be eliminated, and we'd keep going until we had 2 candidates left. Whoever got a majority would be nominated. And there's all kinds of ways you can do that, fast or slow, depending on the situation. But another thing we have to start thinking is that as delegates to the state convention, we're not voters as much as we're representatives. So it sometimes is a bit of an irritation to have to be there, 10 hours, sometimes have to be there 2 days. But the thing is, we're all representing thousands of people back home. Each of the delegates in our county is representing about 1,100 Republicans. I think about the same number applies here. So every one of us has a responsibility to stay there till the end, and I welcome the responsibility.
Does that system work better if you have a state that requires you to register by party?
It can work better, but here, and that's certainly something I would like to see us move to in Georgia. But the beauty of the convention system is that there are checks and balances. You have your caucus where everyone can participate, and everyone does who wants to be involved in the process. And then your your precinct caucus, just like here in Fayette and Coweta, elects their precinct delegates to the county convention. The county convention then elects the statewide delegates. So you have checks and balances. So if you have a whole bunch of Democrats come storming in and maybe take over 1 or 2 precincts, they may take over those precincts, but at the county level, we're going to say, just a minute here, we know you're not really conservatives, and you're not coming in here with pure intentions, so you're not going to the next level. And it's all out in the open. It's straight up and down, majority vote on every issue, just like it should be. It's not minority rule. It's not a tiny little plurality can tell everyone else what to do. You have to get majority vote for every delegate spot at the state convention every time. Y'all remember, y'all had a nice long convention here in Fayette, didn't you? Yeah, well, that process, y'all know from that experience that people who do not represent the party don't make the cut. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think our party's lost 2 elections because we had guys who are our 5th choice. We had the political version of a shotgun wedding. And we're surprised that it ends in divorce in 1 or 2 years. We've got to get a system in place. We've got to restore a system where the people's candidate, the grassroots candidate, is nominated so we can get some enthusiasm into our party for a change. You think we're ever going to win an election with, say, Hillary Clinton, who will be such a huge rock star on the Democrat side? Women will go crazy over that campaign, and we just have so much enthusiasm for her. And do you think we're ever going to beat her with a candidate who is everyone's 3rd choice? That's good. We're up from 5th choice. Man, we're improving. Bob.
Brant, when we go to the state convention, we'll vote on the state chairman.
Mm-hmm.
How do those candidates fall out regarding this issue?
Good question. It's one of the things that's on each of your cards. There are certain things that each of you can do. You can, if you're a delegate at state convention, you can support this resolution. You can also vote for a candidate who supports this reform. Alex Johnson, who's running, is very enthusiastic for it. John Pageant has expressed interest in it, as has Seth Hart. I haven't heard from B.J. Van Gundy yet. My sources tell me he's not too crazy about the idea. But I would encourage you to look into that, and if you get a chance to meet the candidates or talk to them, and you can, because those of you who are delegates, you're one of just 2,000 people or less, because a lot of counties didn't have delegates. 2,000 people, they're going to take your phone call. If you leave a message and say, I'm a delegate, they're going to call you back pretty fast, because each one of you are high-value, high-information voters who took the time to participate. So you can ask them that question, and I would encourage you to do so and to find out which candidate is really going to bring some change, because they're all talking about the same thing. We're going to bring in, we'll raise money, we'll do all this and that. Well, that's good, But has it not occurred to any of them to follow the example of our friends in Virginia who nominated the dark horse candidate for Attorney General? A guy you probably never heard of named Ken Cuccinelli. Ken was the dark horse candidate. He didn't have a lot of money, but he came into the convention. He had the passionate grassroots on his side, much like Reagan did in '76 versus the old establishment, Gerald Ford. And he won the nomination in Virginia. Same thing happened in Utah. Mike Lee, constitutional lawyer, nobody ever heard of. When I first read about that race, I thought, Mike Lee, never heard of him, he ain't got a chance. Defeated a 3-term incumbent, Bob Bennett, whose dad had been a senator from Utah. They were like the Kennedys of Utah. But the grassroots were sick of the moderate, meandering Bob Bennett, and they nominated 2 candidates out of the convention to go to the primary. Mike Lee and a guy named Burkhalter, who was a fiscal conservative. And Mike Lee so impressed the people that he ended up winning the nomination. Now he's in the Senate, and he is one of the 2 most conservative senators, arguably, in the history of the country, based on his voting record. That never would have happened if we had let the moderates and the big money choose our candidate in Utah.
Randy?
I have a couple of issues. You know, there's always 2 sides to everything. And I like the caucus thing, don't get me wrong. But I also worry about, you know, Republicans caucusing, Democrats primary. Their candidates are out there before everybody, getting a lot of, you know, publicity and being seen. And a lot of this is, the voting is popularity contest. I mean, this day and time. So our people are not out there. Also, you know, this thing where how it might be spun by the Democrats. That Democrats say, oh, they're disenfranchising the voters, you know, and these are issues that we need to talk about so we can have a plan to deal with. I mean, we don't need to just stand back.
Well, you're absolutely right, and I'd refer you back to my point earlier. 16% turnout in Iowa, 13% turnout on average in Iowa, 16% national turnout for presidential primaries. There's not a big disparity there. And the other thing, and you raised excellent points, like for example, Democrats use primaries, right? And we don't. We're using conventions. That's going to hurt us, right? Well, in Virginia, Republicans have been using conventions for 20 or 40 years. Democrats, they use primaries. Republicans have won the governor's mansion more times than not in the last 20 years. In the last 20 years, we won in '93, we won in '97, we won in 2009. Democrats won in '01 and '05. We've won most of the time in Virginia. We've controlled the General Assembly up there about 2 years out of 3. We use conventions up there. They use primaries. And you talk about media attention. That's another good point. But you got to ask yourself, what do you get media attention for? For ripping each other to pieces. And you have to do that. In a primary system, you have to fight out. You have to hold your family disputes out in public in front of the whole church to see, because that's the nature of the system. You have to tear each other down, particularly in states where there's no runoff, because you don't have to get a majority. You don't have to be nice to the other guy's supporter. You just have to tear him down and destroy his reputation so that you can get just a few more votes. In Illinois, they nominated a candidate for governor in 2010 who had 22% of the vote. His opponent had 21.5%. He was the winning candidate, 22%, because the party was so fractured. And they ended up losing a seat they should have won. This is right after Rod Blagojevich. We should have carried that seat. We did very well in the other offices. But we had a candidate who did not have the broad enough base support to win that election. And that wouldn't happen if we used conventions.
Grant,
Mm-hmm.
I'd like
Thank you,
to
Jim.
address his question a little bit. So you don't have to have the convention in July. You can have the convention last the second week or the third week in April, just before qualifying. So that whenever your candidate is qualified or determined, then they go and they qualify at the Capitol that last week of April. So you're really all those months ahead of everybody else with your candidate in the primary. And essentially by doing that, you've already got the person out there campaigning for the general election starting in April instead of July.
That's a very good point, Jim. You know, you start, if this were to be implemented, the state law requires that we have our conventions 150 days before the general election. So that would be the minimum we could do it. Absolute closest would be late May, about where we do it now. So we have our nomination in May, and then we're all settled, we've got our candidate. The Democrats don't vote till July. So for 2 more months, all the media will be talking about, our guy will be out there raising money, getting ready to suiting up, building alliances with his old rivals. Democrats, all the media will be talking about is how Roy Barnes was slashing into Thurgood Baker, how DuBose Porter was cutting into Thurgood Baker, back and forth. They'll be the guys who will be talked about as cutting each other to pieces, while we'll have time to get strong for November.
One other point, let me just say this too, about the primaries. When nobody shows up for the primaries, do you think they're gonna continue to have them? No. Think of all the billions of dollars this state spends every year, millions, but a little more numbers we can understand. Dragging the voting machines out, dragging them back in, taking them back out, get them back in, hiring people to work the polls, counting the votes, trying to figure out who did this, who did that. It's ridiculous. People are voting weary. I mean, I voted, I still ain't done anything. The reality is that this state and this country is spending so much money on ridiculous actions that it's got to change. Or there won't be anybody bothered with it, and if the Republicans do away with it, the Democrats will be soon following, you won't even have one. Now, when it comes to referendums and things like that, that all should be on the general election anyway. I mean, to have a special referendum for this and a special referendum for that, have it one time so that when everybody goes to the polls, they can take care of this business. When I was a young man, that was a holiday. Everybody got out of school on November the, whatever it was, for elections, because everybody went voting. I mean, they want to need to have stuff.
We have, I think we have time for, let's see.
Did that answer your question in the back, Counselor? Randy?
Yeah, Randy, did that answer your question? We got 10 minutes till 10. I don't want to keep y'all here. I'll be happy to talk for as long as you want after the meeting, but I'll take 1 or 2 more questions. Okay.
Does this eliminate primaries for local candidates as well?
This would put that authority in the hands of the Republican Party to decide. So I personally don't think we need to eliminate primaries in the local level because it's small enough, the districts are small enough where people can still get elected running and deciding, like Randy, it's a great example. It's local level, he can do that. But he couldn't do that running for Congress or even the state Senate because the district is so big and the money required is so massive and the power of incumbency is just so overwhelming that it just keeps candidates out of the process. This would be for statewide and congressional, where we already have the built-in framework. We've got the district conventions that we all went to, and you have the state convention we're about to go into, and this would also be good for the national levels, where particularly the national, where we're really seeing conservatives being treated as second-class citizens.
So you wouldn't save the money? You still have a primary, you still get out the voting machine, right?
If they wanted to.
Yeah, locally that's true, but that would be a matter for us to debate later on. The issue at hand is not necessarily saving the taxpayer money, and actually you do. And for every name you have to put on the ballot, for every additional area, that does cost money. It's not the whole thing, but it does cost a percentage. And the other thing is that what we're really concerned about is saving our own resources, our own Republican resources, to fight a general election. And if, some states do use local level conventions as well, but that's something each local area should decide in my view. But the issue at hand is, are we going to be strong and united and spend our money defeating Democrats? Or are we going to be divided and divisive, spending our money cutting each other's throats? Yes, sir. Last question. Thank you.
My name is Robert Ladd. I'm the infantry combat veteran. Spent a little more time in the military. It was project planner and project manager. And listen to your oratory presentation. What I used to refer to as the iceberg effect. You got about 30% above the water and 70% below it. What I'm concerned about is that at one time this was in effect, and then it was changed to a primary. Now, before you go back to that, from what I remember when it was just the caucus, there was a lot of, everything was done behind doors, closed doors, locked doors. And then they changed it to the primary because the people wanted to know what was going on. They wanted to be able to participate. There is a difficulty in getting the population as a general to participate in the election. It's been that way ever since I can remember. What is going to be your ability to take and present this, and how are you going to prevent going back to the old locks doors and not let the general people
Well, they don't
know
allow
what's
smoking
going
indoors
on?
anymore, so which smoke filter?
Let me talk. I've got the floor if you want to talk, and you wait till I finish. When you're able to take and convince the people that their participation, their voice, the little people's voice is going to be heard, I think you'll be able to sell this. But you need to be able to take and say, this change is going to take and be a benefit the general public. Trying to get the general public actively involved has been difficult from ever since I can remember.
Well, I agree with you. I for a long time, I thought the same way you did, and I studied on it, and what I found was that if you compare the process, if you read a little bit into history, you hear a lot about the smoke-filled rooms, but time and time again, you read about candidates who are running for office, candidates nominated. They were nominated by a groundswell of support at the convention by people who wanted to find someone they could all agree with. And if you look at, as far as influence goes, you all have a great influence in choosing our next state chairman because you're all delegates. Think about what would happen if we chose our state chairman by primary. It would cost $2 or $3 million. Hardly anyone could afford to participate. And your vote would be neutralized by any Democrat who decided to come in and just play around with our process. When it comes to transparency, it's an excellent question. And we do have to fight this myth of the smoke-filled room. But when you look at this, consider this. You have a primary today, right? Electronic voting. There's not a paper trail unless you vote absentee. And they put it all in the Excel spreadsheet, and you say, I want to recount. Okay, refresh. Here's your recount. There's no paper trail. At a convention, most of the time, votes are taken by stand-up vote. Like in the legislature, as representatives, we all stand up, let our voice be heard, and the votes are counted openly. I don't think, third convention, district convention, most of us were there. It was a clear-cut victory on every ballot with about 30 vote margin or more on each one vote, and every time we had a clear decision. There was no hanky-panky. No one even thought there was hanky-panky because we saw everyone was voting. Everyone made their vote clear. We didn't take it behind closed doors to count the votes. So, to your point, I mean, it's the American way. Town hall democracy. Get everyone together in a room. We hammer out an agreement. We all express our views. And at the end of the day, we stand united behind our new leader. There's a reason why it was done this way in the founding era, because the founders believed in representative government and at the local level, rather than a massive demagoguing system at the much larger level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.